You never think your house is going to haunt your children. You think maybe they'll remember it for the creaky floors or the scent of cinnamon in winter, not the shadows behind their eyes, or the way they sleepwalk into a void. I'm Sarah. I'm a mother of two boys, Ethan and James, and this is a story I've carried for years. I used to talk myself out of telling it, afraid it sounded too ridiculous, too unmotherly. But now, with both boys away at college, the house quieter than it's ever been, I can finally say it aloud. It started with Ethan. He was 7 when it began. A bright kid, bookish, curious, full of questions about dinosaurs and galaxies. But around that age, he started sleepwalking. I'd find him standing in the hallway just outside his room, always the same spot, always facing the same stretch of wall. His eyes would be wide open but blank, like they were looking through something I couldn't see. And then, the tapping. He would sway gently back and forth, like he was listening to music only he could hear. Then he'd begin to softly tap his forehead against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Just like ritualistic. The first few times, I chalked it up to normal childhood sleepwalking. I'd gently guide him back to bed, and in the morning, he'd remember nothing. But it kept happening, night after night. Always that same place on the wall, 3 feet from the floor, 6 inches left of the old thermostat. I started marking it with tape, then with a pencil, just to confirm what I already knew. It was exactly the same spot every time. When I asked Ethan about it during the day, he'd furrow his brow and say, "What do you mean? I don't sleepwalk." Years passed. The episodes tapered off and eventually stopped. I was relieved, convinced it had been a bizarre phase. He grew out of it. I let it go. And then James came along. He was born 7 years after Ethan. Different personality, more sensitive, quieter, prone to daydreaming and wandering around barefoot even in winter. When he turned 7, I remember thinking, stupidly, at least he won't go through the same sleepwalking thing Ethan did. I was wrong. I'll never forget the first night. I woke up to the faint sound of rhythmic tapping. I assumed it was the wind rattling something loose, but as I got out of bed, the air felt off. There he was, James. Standing in the hallway, eyes open, unblinking. He was in the spot. I froze. He tilted forward and tapped his forehead against the wall, just like his brother had. Same motion, same rhythm. My heart raced. He couldn't have known. He was a toddler when Ethan stopped. He'd never seen it. I didn't move for a minute. I just watched him. The sway, the tap, the way his hands dangled at his sides was like he was underwater. I finally stepped forward and whispered his name. His eyes flicked toward me, but it was like he looked through me. I led him gently back to bed. He went without a word. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I told myself I was overreacting. But then, it happened again, and again, for months. Always the same pattern. The hallway, the same place on the wall, that mindless tapping. I mentioned it to my husband, Dan, and though he was concerned, he leaned on logic. "It's probably just a developmental thing," he said. "Maybe it's genetic, some kind of neurological quirk." But even he started to feel unsettled after he saw it with his own eyes. We consulted doctors, sleep specialists, a child psychologist. No one could explain it beyond generalized night terrors or subconscious behavior patterns. But none of that made sense. Not when the details, the exact physical gestures, matched so precisely between our sons. 7 years apart. No overlap. No explanation. We tried everything. Salt lamps, prayer, therapy. Even briefly entertained the idea of moving bedrooms. But nothing changed it. Until, like Ethan, James eventually just stopped. He turned 10, and one day it was just over. No more sleepwalking, no more tapping. And like Ethan, he remembered nothing. Years went by. The boys grew up, graduated from high school, and left for college. We were proud and tired, and we started talking about finally updating the house, fixing the old floors, redoing the kitchen, pulling down the faded wallpaper in the hallway. We waited until summer, when the house would be mostly empty. The wallpaper in the hall came off in long strips. It was a tedious job, revealing layers of paint and primer beneath. But when we got to the section, the spot, something was different. The texture of the wall changed. There was a faint seam, like a border where there shouldn't be one. Dan paused and looked at me. "Does this look like a door frame to you?" I leaned in. My stomach turned cold. Beneath the last layer of paint was a subtle outline, rectangular, about the width of a narrow door. There were faint vertical impressions where hinges might have been. The wall had been carefully patched over, smoothed out, and then painted to blend in seamlessly. We stood in silence for what felt like minutes. "That's the spot," I whispered. "That's where they always stood." Dan didn't respond at first. He ran his hand down the middle of the outline. "There's no room behind here," he finally said. "Just the crawl space and support beams. This isn't a door to anything." But it was. Once we took photos, measured, checked the other side of the wall. There was nothing, no bump, no hidden gap, no secret room, just wood and plaster and the ghost of something that had once been. I tried to stay calm, but the thoughts kept coming. What were they drawn to? Why that exact spot? Why both boys at the same age, in the same way? What instinct or entity led them to that buried passage? That night I dreamt of the hallway. I was walking toward that wall. The wallpaper was new again, pristine, but there was a soft glow bleeding from the outline of the door, as if something warm pulsed behind it. The closer I got, the more the sound grew. Soft tapping, not from fingers or knuckles, but from foreheads. Many of them. Gently, patiently, waiting to be let in, or to come through. I woke up gasping. The next day we finished removing the wallpaper, but we didn't paint. I couldn't bring myself to erase it again. I left that faint doorframe visible, a scar we no longer had the right to cover. A few weeks later, Ethan came home for a weekend visit. He walked down the hall and stopped cold. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the doorframe. I asked him if it looked familiar. He stared at it blankly. "No," he said. But something about his voice cracked. That night I woke up and checked the hallway. Quiet. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, until I noticed the floorboard near the frame, a soft scuff mark in the dust, a faint crescent-shaped smear on the wall. About 3 feet up. I haven't told the boys the full story, not yet. Maybe one day I will. All I know is some part of this house remembers. Some part of it was never truly closed. And our sons, our sweet sleeping boys, were trying to find their way back to a door that shouldn't exist. Maybe the door wasn't meant for them, or maybe it was. Either way, I've stopped pretending it was nothing. There is something behind that wall. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. It's the kind of thing people chalk up to overactive imaginations, to childhood fears and dramatized memories. But I was there. I saw what it did to my son, and I've carried it with me for almost 15 years now. It started when Sam was 9. We had just moved to a new town in Northern Virginia. Quiet streets, good schools, a place we thought we'd plant roots. Sam adjusted quickly. He was a gentle kid, thoughtful and empathetic to a fault. He made friends fast, but one in particular stood out. A boy named Julian. Julian was odd. Not in the way some kids are quirky or shy. His oddness felt intentional. He watched people closely, smiled too much or not at all, and had this way of talking that made you forget how young he was. Like he was imitating what he thought a child should sound like, mimicking normalcy. At first, I thought I was just being judgmental. Julian was polite when I met him, always called me Mrs. Hanley, always said please and thank you. His mother, Claire, was sweet and soft-spoken, a woman with tired eyes and a voice like chamomile tea. They lived just 2 streets over in a ranch-style home with wind chimes that never stopped. Then came the incident at school. I got a call from the principal one afternoon saying Sam had been involved in a minor altercation. I panicked naturally and rushed to the school. Sam was sitting outside the office, pale and silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. The principal explained that Sam had struck Julian on the side of the head with a book during reading time. That didn't sound like my son. Sam never hit anyone. He was the kind of kid who cried when we squashed a spider. I tried to make sense of it, but Sam refused to talk on the drive home. I pressed him. He just shook his head and whispered, "It wasn't my fault. He told me to." That night, after hours of coaxing, the story came out. Julian had dared him to play a game, something he called Whisper King. It involved saying a phrase into a book, closing your eyes and hitting the other player to wake them up. Sam said he didn't understand the game, but Julian kept insisting it would be fun, that it was what Mr. Elroy would want. I didn't know who Mr. Elroy was. When I asked, Sam just said, "It's someone Julian talks to in the mirror." I'll admit, I laughed. Nervous laugh, of course. Kids and their imaginary friends. But something about the name stuck with me. Elroy. It felt wrong, heavy in the mouth. Julian's mother called me the next day. Claire was gracious, apologetic. Said Julian felt terrible, that he told her it was just a game gone wrong. We talked for a while, and I softened. Maybe it really was just kids being weird and testing boundaries. She suggested a sleepover to help the boys move past the awkwardness. They really do like each other, she said. I think they just need a reset. Against my better judgment, I agreed. That Friday, I dropped Sam off at their house. Julian answered the door with his usual too-wide grin and led Sam inside without a word. Claire met me at the door with tea and a warm smile. She had that same frazzled air I recognized in myself. Single mom, always a little tired, always trying too hard to make things feel normal. We talked for a bit. She spoke about Julian's sensitivities, how he was deeply imaginative, how he sometimes created personas to cope with change. She didn't say the words, but I could tell she was trying to prepare me for something. When I asked casually about Julian's father, her expression went blank. "It's just the two of us," she said quietly. That was the first time I felt a real chill. Still, I smiled, said my goodbyes, and left. Sam seemed excited. Maybe this would be good for him. A weird, memorable night with a strange friend that he'd laugh about years later. But that night changed everything. Sam came home the next morning looking exhausted. His face was pale, his eyes red. On the drive home, I asked how it went. He didn't answer. I didn't push. I just let him be. But later that afternoon, he asked if he could sleep in our room that night. When I asked why, he looked at me and said, "Julian wasn't Julian." It took nearly 2 days for the full story to come out. That night, after Claire had said goodnight and the boys had laid down on their sleeping bags in Julian's room, Sam had trouble falling asleep. There was a candle burning on the desk, which he thought was strange. But he kept his eyes shut and tried to drift off. Sometime after midnight, he woke up to whispering. At first, he thought Julian was talking in his sleep. But when he peeked through his lashes, he saw Julian kneeling in front of the full-length mirror in the corner. The candle still burned beside him, casting strange shadows across the room. Julian was speaking in a deep, raspy voice, not like a kid imitating a grown-up. This voice didn't belong to Julian's throat. He was rocking slowly, eyes wide, whispering, "Elroy sees. Elroy knows. Elroy is the door." Sam stayed as still as he could, terrified. Then Julian, no, Mr. Elroy, as Sam called him, began laughing. Soft at first, then higher, until it sounded like choking. "He's listening," Julian said to the mirror. "He knows who the weak ones are." Then he turned. He crawled over to Sam's sleeping bag, leaned down, and began whispering in that same voice. Sam didn't understand the words. He said it wasn't English, just murmured sounds, low and rhythmic, like chanting. He kept his eyes closed. He said he could feel Julian's breath on his cheek. After a while, Julian crawled back to the mirror. And then, just as suddenly, snuffed out the candle and laid back down like nothing had happened. Sam didn't sleep the rest of the night. When he told me all this, my stomach turned. I told myself it must have been a dream, just a nightmare, brought on by nerves and a new environment. But Sam was so clear. He remembered details, the words, the tone, the candle. Kids don't make up things like that with such precision. I called Claire that night. At first, she laughed nervously, said Julian sometimes talked in his sleep, that he'd always had a vivid imagination. But as I pressed, told her what Sam had said, her tone shifted. She went quiet. Then she said something I'll never forget. It's getting harder to control. He's been seeing someone about it, but nothing helps for long. I asked what it was. After a long pause, she said, they think it might be dissociative identity disorder. He's been other people before. Sometimes they're harmless. Sometimes... She trailed off. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was ask, has he ever hurt anyone? Claire's voice broke. That's why we moved. I hung up not long after. I didn't want to hear more. I didn't want to imagine what she meant by other people. I just wanted to keep my son away from whatever that boy was dealing with. I told the school everything the following week. They were alarmed but vague in their response, citing privacy concerns. I didn't care. I just wanted Sam safe. And then 2 days later, it happened. Julian attacked a classmate on the playground. It was sudden and brutal. He broke the other boy's arm and tried to bite his neck. Staff had to pull him off. The story made it to parents' ears before the end of the day. But by the next morning, Julian and Claire were gone. No goodbye, no warning, no forwarding address. The house was left neat and locked. Empty. I tried calling. The number was disconnected. The school said they had no forwarding information. Claire didn't work, had no online presence, no social media. It was like they'd vanished into smoke. Sam never saw him again. He's grown now, about to graduate college, stable, kind, smart. But every now and then I'll catch him staring into a mirror a bit too long. Lost in thought. When I ask what he's thinking, he always says the same thing. I wonder if Julian knew he wasn't alone in there. That part chills me. Because in the years since, I've read, I've researched, I've come across stories about children who speak in voices that aren't theirs. Children with imaginary friends who demand blood, who whisper in tongues, who carve doorways in the minds of others. I've seen the name Elroy show up in more places than I'd like to admit. Sometimes in message boards, sometimes in old police reports, a name passed down like an infection. I still don't know what Julian really was. A boy with an illness? A vessel for something older? Darker? All I know is this. My son came close, too close, to something I can't explain. I've tried for years to tell myself it was all in my head. Childhood trauma, a confused memory, the strange chemistry of a brain shaped by fear and faith. But now, at 53, with 2 grown children of my own, I can admit it. Some things don't feel explainable, and I still don't know what my mother really was. I was raised in a strict Pentecostal home in rural Tennessee. You know the kind. Hymns loud enough to shake the drywall, sermons longer than Sunday afternoon, and pastors who didn't care much for metaphors. Our church didn't believe in ghosts. Spirits were real, yes, but they were demons, plain and simple. No gray area, no ambiguity. If something unseen moved in your house, it wasn't the soul of your grandmother. It was the devil, disguised and waiting. That theology sank into my skin early. I couldn't sleep in the dark without imagining something crouched in the corner. We were told to guard our hearts and our homes, that to open yourself up, to doubt, to fear, to sin, was to invite things in. My mother didn't care for church. She was never cruel about it. She just wasn't present. She'd drop me off at the chapel with my aunt or a neighbor, then vanish back home without explanation. I didn't understand it at the time. I thought maybe she was lazy or tired, but now I think she just couldn't stand being in a room full of people who looked at her and whispered behind their hands. She wasn't well. She'd had me at 17 and struggled with pills and cheap whiskey for most of her adult life. Sometimes she'd disappear for a day or two and come back with bruises and a distant stare. I never knew where she went. She never told me, and by the time I was old enough to ask, I'd learned not to. The first time something happened, I was 9. I'd woken from a nightmare, one so vivid it made me cry into my pillow. In the dream, I was in our kitchen, sitting at the table, watching my mother stand at the sink with her back to me. She turned slowly and smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too dry. Her eyes were pitch black. No whites, just orbs. She walked toward me, barefoot and slow, and said, "I'm not her anymore." I woke up screaming, and when I ran into the kitchen to catch my breath, she was there, wearing the same clothes as in the dream, standing at the sink, with her back to me. She turned and looked at me with that same smile, then said, word for word, "I'm not her anymore." I bolted back to my room and slammed the door. She laughed. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. When I finally asked her about it, her brow furrowed like I'd made it all up. "What are you talking about, baby?" she asked. "I went to bed early last night. You were the only one up. I didn't press it. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did." A few weeks later, there was the snake. We lived near the edge of a wooded patch, and sometimes black snakes would wind up on the porch. My mother hated snakes. Couldn't even look at a picture of one without breaking into a sweat. But that afternoon, she walked barefoot into the yard, where one had curled under a patio chair, and picked it up, calm, almost gentle. I watched through the window in disbelief as she held the thing in both hands, murmured something I couldn't hear, then flung it back into the woods like it was nothing. Later that night, I asked her why she'd done it. She looked at me like I was lying. "I'd never touch a snake," she said. "You know that. Don't joke like that." She wasn't messing with me. I could see it. She meant it. I started sleeping with a Bible under my pillow after that. But the worst was the lock-in. Our youth group had organized one of those all-night prayer nights at the church, where the kids would play games in the fellowship hall and then move into the chapel for worship and devotions. I was 12 then. I hadn't told anyone about what had been happening at home, not even Pastor Reeves. I was ashamed and confused. That night, sometime around 2 a.m., we were in the main sanctuary. The lights were low, just a few lanterns on the floor near the altar. Some kids were praying, others were dozing. I remember sitting in one of the pews, flipping through Psalms to stay awake. Then I saw her, my mother. She was outside the chapel doors. The church had big glass-paneled entry doors that looked out into the dark foyer, and she was just standing there, barefoot, hair wet and plastered to her face, like she'd run through a rainstorm. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame, but what froze me wasn't how she looked. It was what she was doing. She was whispering, not talking. Whispering fast, mouth moving nonstop, like a silent chant, and smiling. That vacant, empty smile I'd only seen in my dreams. She never knocked, never opened the door, just stood there for what felt like an hour, eyes locked on mine, mouthing something I couldn't hear or understand. When I blinked, she was gone. The next morning, when the lock-in ended, I got in the car and sat in silence the whole way home. She was in the kitchen when we got back, making eggs, humming, dry, warm, hair brushed, acting like nothing had happened. When I asked her about the night before, she just gave me a look and said, "Sweetheart, I've been home all night. You must have dreamt it." That was her go-to line always. "You must have dreamt it." I started wondering if maybe I had, if my childhood had warped my sense of reality, if my faith had made me see demons where there were only breakdowns, if I'd created monsters from the pieces of a broken woman I loved and didn't understand. She died when I was 22. Overdose. Her heart gave out in a rest stop bathroom off Interstate 40. They said she was alone when it happened, but I wonder if she believed that. There were no answers, no long-lost journals, no final note scrawled in lipstick on a bathroom mirror, just silence, and a memory that still knocks when the house gets quiet. I've spoken to counselors, pastors, a psychiatrist once during a hard season. Some believe it was schizophrenia. Others think it was dissociative identity disorder. I've read about trauma-induced fugue states and how some addicts can enter episodes of hallucination that mimic possession. But none of that explains how she knew my dreams, Or how she looked me in the eyes from a locked church door miles from home, barefoot and smiling like she was waiting for something to open. My old church dismissed ghosts, but not demons. And I wonder sometimes if they were wrong to separate the two. Because whatever followed my mother, it wasn't a person. It wasn't her. It was something that borrowed her skin and learned how to walk in it. And some nights, I wake from sleep, heart pounding, convinced I've heard whispering at my bedroom door. I don't open it. I just pray she's finally at rest, and that whatever had her never found a way in.